Marcus Blackwell's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his Lamborghini, watching the woman he'd spent 3 years trying to forget emerge from the small cafe across the street. Even from this distance, he could see those familiar, emerald eyes that had once looked at him with such love, now focused entirely on the small child in her arms. The child who had his exact same piercing blue eyes and the distinctive Blackwell cleft chin that had been passed down through generations of his family. The rain pelted against the windshield as Marcus sat frozen in his car, his mind racing back to that horrible night 3 years ago when everything fell apart. He'd been so consumed with proving his worth to his father's board of directors, so determined to show he deserved the Blackwell empire, that he'd missed every sign that his marriage to Elena was crumbling. "You're never here anymore, Marcus." She had pleaded that final evening, tears streaming down her face as she stood in their penthouse kitchen. "When was the last time we actually talked? When was the last time you looked at me like I mattered more than your next business deal?" Thirteen. He'd been on his phone, of course, closing a merger worth hundreds of millions while his wife poured her heart out. "Elena, you knew what you were signing up for when you married me. The Blackwell name comes with responsibilities. I married—" "Marcus, not the Blackwell name," she'd whispered, her voice breaking. "But I don't think that person exists anymore." By morning she was gone. Divorce papers arrived a week later, and despite his team of lawyers trying to delay the proceedings, Elena had vanished completely. No forwarding address, no mutual friends who would admit to knowing where she went. It was as if she'd simply erased herself from his world. Now, 3 years later, here she was in Portland, Oregon, of all places, and she wasn't alone. Marcus watched as Elena adjusted the small boy in her arms, maybe 2.5 years old, with thick dark hair that caught the light exactly like Marcus's did. The child was fussing, and Elena was making funny faces to calm him down, that same gentle smile Marcus remembered falling in love with 8 years ago. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. "Mr. Blackwell, the Seattle meeting has been moved to 4 p.m. Should I reschedule your flight?" Marcus stared at the message, then back at Elena, who was now walking toward a beat-up Honda Civic that was at least 10 years old. This was the woman who'd once driven a custom Bentley, who'd had unlimited access to his black cards, who'd lived in a penthouse worth $20 million. Now she was struggling to get a car seat secured while balancing the child, her clothes simple and worn, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail instead of the elaborate styles his money had once paid for. The child was definitely his son. Marcus knew it with the same certainty he'd known when his father was dying, that he'd have to take over the company whether he wanted to or not. The timeline was perfect. Elena would have been pregnant when she left him, probably didn't even know it yet herself. His hands shook as he started the engine. He could drive away right now, pretend he'd never seen them, go back to his empty penthouse and his board meetings and his perfectly controlled life where nothing could hurt him because he never let anyone close enough to matter. Or he could follow that beat-up Honda and face the biggest mistake of his life. Elena was pulling out of the parking space now, signaling left toward what looked like a residential neighborhood. Marcus had maybe 10 seconds to decide. The logical choice was obvious. He was Marcus Blackwell, worth $3.2 billion, CEO of Blackwell Industries, one of the most powerful men on the West Coast. He didn't chase after ex-wives. He didn't disrupt carefully constructed new lives. He certainly didn't complicate things by inserting himself into situations where he clearly wasn't wanted. But that child had his eyes. Marcus pulled out behind, the Honda keeping his distance, his heart pounding harder than it had during his first hostile takeover. The rain was getting heavier, and Elena's car was struggling up the hill toward what looked like a lower-income neighborhood, the kind of place Marcus hadn't set foot in since he was a teenager, working summers at his father's factories to build character. The Honda turned into the driveway of a small duplex with peeling paint and a yard that needed work. Marcus parked across the street, watching as Elena got out and carefully lifted the child from his car seat. The boy was awake now, looking around with bright, curious eyes that missed nothing, exactly like Marcus had been as a child, according to every family story. Elena was talking to the boy as she walked toward the front door, her voice, too, quiet for Marcus to hear, but her body language animated and loving. She was pointing out things in the yard, a bird maybe, or a neighbor's cat. The kind of patient, attentive parenting Marcus remembered his own mother providing before the cancer took her when he was 8. The front door opened before Eleanor could reach it, and a woman in her 60s appeared, arms outstretched for the child. Elena's mother, Marcus realized with a jolt. He'd met Margaret Chen exactly once at his wedding to Elena, and the woman had made it crystal clear she thought her daughter was making a mistake marrying into the Blackwell family. "Money doesn't buy happiness," she told Marcus during the ball reception, her voice polite but her eyes steely. "It just makes misery more comfortable." He'd brushed off the comment at the time, secure in his belief that love would be enough to bridge any gap between his world and Eleanor's. How spectacularly wrong he'd been. Now Margaret was taking the child, his son, into her arms with the easy confidence of someone who'd been helping raise him from birth. Elena was laughing at something the boy had done, and even from across the street Marcus could see the genuine joy on her face. When was the last time he'd seen her look that happy during their marriage? The answer came immediately. Their honeymoon in Tuscany, before the pressure of the business started consuming every moment of their lives together. Marcus watched them disappear into the house, and for several minutes he just sat there, rain, drumming on the roof of his car, trying to process what he'd discovered. He had a son who was being raised in a duplex in Portland instead of the Blackwell estate in Napa Valley, a son who would probably grow up never knowing his father's name. Like his phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard Blackwell, his father, supposedly retired but still monitoring every aspect of the company from his estate in Martha's Vineyard. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with Henderson. He says you missed the Seattle meeting." Marcus closed his eyes. "I had to handle something urgent. More urgent than the Morrison acquisition? Son, we've been working on this deal for 6 months. Morrison Industries could put us in the top 5 defense contractors in the country. I understand the importance, Dad. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're letting personal distractions interfere with business again. We can't afford another Elena situation." The words hit like a physical blow. Another Elena situation, as if the collapse of his marriage had been nothing more than a quarterly earnings disappointment. "This conversation is over," Marcus said, quietly. "Marcus?" He hung up and immediately turned his phone to silent. Through the window of the duplex, he could see Elena moving around what looked like a small kitchen, probably starting dinner. Normal domestic life continuing exactly as it had before Marcus stumbled back into it. He could still leave. Elena had managed 3 years without him. Clearly she was doing fine. The child looked healthy and happy. Maybe the best thing Marcus could do was walk away and let them continue their peaceful life. But as he was reaching for the ignition, the front door opened again and Eleanor stepped onto the small porch, looking directly at his car. Even from across the street, he could see her face go completely white. Marcus felt his breath catch. She'd spotted him. After 3 years of successfully staying hidden, their accidental reunion had lasted exactly 47 minutes before she realized she was being watched. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then she walked down the steps and across the street, with the same determined stride Marcus remembered from their worst arguments, when she'd refused to back down no matter how loud his voice got. She stopped beside his driver's side window and waited. Marcus had negotiated billion-dollar deals with some of the most ruthless business people in the world. He'd testified before Congress, been interviewed by hostile journalists face down, corporate raiders who wanted to tear apart everything his family had built. None of that had prepared him for rolling down his window and looking into Elena's eyes again. "Hello, Marcus." Her voice was exactly the same, warm honey with just a hint of the accent that revealed her grandmother had immigrated from the Philippines. She looked older, tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before but somehow more beautiful than he remembered. There was a confidence in her posture that had been missing during the last year of their marriage, when she'd seemed to shrink a little more each day. "Eleanor." His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "You look like someone who's been hiding from you for 3 years." She folded her arms across her chest. across her chest. "What are you doing here, Marcus? How did you find us?" "I didn't. I was driving to a meeting in Seattle, stopped for coffee, and—" He gestured helplessly toward the cafe. Pure coincidence. Right, because Marcus Blackwell just happens to be in Portland drinking coffee at a neighborhood cafe instead of having someone else handle that kind of mundane task. She had a point. Marcus hadn't bought his own coffee in probably a decade. "My driver got food poisoning. I was killing. Time before my flight." Elena studied his face with the same intense focus she'd once used to determine whether he was telling her the truth about working late or hiding something bigger. "You saw him." It wasn't a question. "Elena, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not about this." Marcus looked past her toward the house where warm light was spilling from the windows, and he could see Margaret moving around inside with the child. His son. "He looks like me. He looks like himself." The timeline fits. Elena's jaw tightened. "You always were good with math. Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung between them, loaded with 3 years of hurt and confusion and anger. Elena was quiet for so long Marcus thought she might just walk away without answering. Finally, "Because you made it very clear that your real children were board meetings and profit margins and proving yourself worthy of the Blackwell name. You didn't have room in your life for an actual child." The words hit harder than any hostile takeover attempt ever had. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Elena's voice was getting louder now, 3 years of suppressed anger starting to surface. "When was the last time you had dinner at home during our marriage, Marcus? When was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? You were so busy becoming your father that you forgot how to be a husband. I was building something for us, for our future. No, you were building something for your ego. There's a difference." Marcus felt his own temper rising. "That company supports thousands of families, Elena. It's not just about money. Everything was about money with you. The house, the cars, the parties we had to attend, the clothes I had to wear. You turned our entire relationship into a business transaction. That's not— Do you remember what you said to me the night I left?" Marcus fell silent. He remembered that night in fragments, like a fever dream he'd tried to forget. He'd been drinking, angry about a deal that had fallen through, taking it out on Elena when she'd tried to talk to him about their marriage. "You said I was lucky to have found someone willing to take care of me," Elena continued, her voice getting quieter but somehow more devastating. "That without you I'd be nobody, that I should be grateful for everything you'd given me instead of complaining all the time." The memory hit him like ice water. He had said that. In his anger and frustration and fear that she was right about how far he'd drifted from the man she'd married, he'd lashed out with the cruelest words he could find. "Elena, I was drunk, angry, having a bad day." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You showed me exactly what you thought of me that night, so when I found out I was pregnant a week later, I already knew what kind of father you'd be." "What kind of father is that?" "The kind who loves his child but never has time to show it. The kind who provides everything except what actually matters. The kind who turns family dinner into a networking opportunity and bedtime stories into lessons about market strategy." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. "You don't know that." "I know you, Marcus, or at least I knew the man you became, and I couldn't watch my son disappear the way I did. You didn't disappear, you left." "Same thing." Eleanor looked back toward the house where the child, their son, was probably having dinner with his grandmother, safe and loved, and completely unaware that his father was sitting 50 feet away. "I needed to remember who I was before I became Mrs. Marcus Blackwell, and I needed to make sure my son would know me as a person, not just as someone who got in the way of business calls." Marcus followed her gaze to the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Margaret holding the boy on her lap while she fed him from a small bowl. The scene looked so normal, so peaceful, the kind of family dinner Marcus hadn't had since he was 8 years old. "What's his name?" Elena hesitated. "David." "David Chen?" "David Chen Martinez." Elena's chin lifted slightly. I went back to my maiden name when the divorce was finalized. Marcus felt another stab of loss. Even in his fantasies about finding Elena again, he'd never imagined she'd taken back her maiden name. It was like she'd systematically erased every trace of their life together. Does he ask about his father? He's 2.5, Marcus. His biggest concerns are whether he gets to watch cartoons after dinner, and if the playground will be dry. Enough tomorrow for the slide, but eventually he will ask. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Eventually. What will you tell him? The truth. That his father is a good man who got lost somewhere along the way, and that sometimes people can't find their way back to each other, no matter how much they want to. The rain was coming down harder now, and Elena was getting soaked, but she made no move to go back inside. Marcus reached across to open the passenger door. Get in. You're getting drenched. Elena looked at the open door like it might be a trap. I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus. I meant just to talk. 5 more minutes. After a long hesitation, Elena walked around and got into the car, immediately making the small space feel charged with electricity. She smelled like vanilla and baby shampoo, completely different from the expensive perfumes she'd worn during their marriage. Nice car, she said, running her hand over the leather seat. New? Last year. Marcus felt suddenly embarrassed by the Lamborghini's ostentation. It's impractical. The trunk barely holds a briefcase. But it's fast. Very fast. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windshield. Marcus could feel Elena's presence like a physical weight, all the history between them filling the car until it was hard to breathe. Are you happy? He asked finally. Elena considered the question seriously. Most days. Are you? The honest answer was no. Marcus hadn't been truly happy since Elena left, but he'd gotten very good at staying busy enough that he didn't have to think about it. Success was a decent substitute for happiness, most of the time. I miss you, he said instead. Helena turned to look at him directly for the first time since getting in the car. You miss the idea of me. You miss having someone waiting at home who made your life feel normal. But you don't miss me, Marcus. You never really knew me well enough to miss me. That's not true. What's my favorite book? The question caught him off guard. What? My favorite book. We were married for 3 years. What's my favorite book? Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. He knew Elena read constantly, had seen her with novels and biographies and poetry collections throughout their marriage, but he'd never asked her about them, had been too busy with his own concerns to pay attention to what she was reading. I don't know, he admitted quietly. The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. I've read it probably 50 times since high school. I used to quote passages from it when I was nervous or excited or sad. You heard me do it hundreds of times. Marcus felt like he was drowning. Elena. What was I studying when we met? Another question he should have known the answer to. Business. Elena shook her head. Social work. I wanted to help families in crisis, work with kids who'd been through trauma. But after we got married, you said it would be awkward for your wife to work for a non-profit when your company was in competition with social service budgets. You suggested I get my MBA instead. Make networking easier at company events. You never told me you minded. I told you constantly, but you heard what you wanted to hear. Elena looked back toward the house. Do you know what I do for work now? Marcus realized he had no idea. What? I'm a victim advocate at the Children's Hospital. I help kids and families navigate the system when they're dealing with abuse or neglect cases. It's exactly what I wanted to do 8 years ago. The weight of his failures was becoming unbearable. Marcus had spent 3 years telling himself that Eleanor had left because she couldn't handle the pressure of his lifestyle, that she'd been unrealistic about what marriage to someone in his position would require. But sitting here now, he was starting to understand that she'd left because he'd systematically erased the person she actually was and tried to replace her with the person he needed her to be. I was a terrible husband. No, Elena said softly. You were a husband who was trying to be someone else. You were so determined to prove you could handle your father's legacy that you forgot about everything else. Through the window, Marcus could see David had finished eating and was now playing with what looked like toy cars on Margaret's living room floor. The boy was making engine noises, completely absorbed in his imaginary world. "Can I meet him?" Elena was quiet for so long, Marcus thought she was going to refuse. "Why?" "Why?" "Because he's my son. That's biology, not a reason. Why do you want to meet him, Marcus? To prove something to yourself? To check off some box on your list of things successful men are supposed to have?" The questions hit too close to home. "Because I made mistakes with you, and I don't want to make them with him." "What makes you think you won't?" Marcus had no answer for that. His track record wasn't exactly encouraging. "If you meet him," Eleanor continued, "you can't just disappear again when things get complicated. Kids aren't business deals, Marcus. You can't negotiate with a toddler when he's having a meltdown, or schedule quality time for when it's convenient for your calendar. If you're going to be his father, you have to actually be his father." "I want to try." Trying isn't enough. He's not a hobby you can pick up when you're bored with work. Marcus looked at Elena's profile in the dim light from the street lamp. "What would it take? For you to let me be part of his life?" "I don't know yet." Elena reached for the door handle. "But I know it would take more than you've ever been willing to give anyone." She got out of the car and started walking back toward the house, then stopped and turned around. "There's a park 2 blocks from here, Maple Grove Park. We go there every Saturday morning at 10. If you want to start somewhere, start there." Then she was gone, disappearing into the house and leaving Marcus alone with the rain and the weight of everything he'd just learned. Marcus sat in his car for another hour, watching the house and trying to process the fact that his entire life had just changed in the span of 90 minutes. The Seattle meeting was definitely out of the question now. Hell, everything was out of the question now. He had a son who was being raised by the woman Marcus had loved and lost in a world Marcus had never bothered to understand. A son who would grow up thinking his father was just a story, unless Marcus could figure out how to become the kind of man who deserved to be more than that. His phone had been buzzing constantly for the past hour, missed calls from his assistant, his lawyers, his father, probably half the board of directors wondering where he was. None of it seemed to matter anymore. Marcus started the car and drove back toward the airport, but instead of heading to the private terminal where his jet was waiting, he found himself pulling into a hotel parking lot. He needed time to think, time to figure out what came next. The desk clerk did a double take when Marcus walked in without luggage or a reservation, still wearing a $3,000 suit, but looking like he'd just survived a natural disaster. "I need a room for tonight." "Of course, Mr. Blackwell." Marcus Blackwell. If the clerk recognized the name, he was too professional to show it. Marcus paid cash for a basic room on the 3rd floor, turned off his phone completely, and spent the night staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what Saturday morning was going to look like. By Friday evening, Marcus had made exactly 3 decisions. He was staying in Portland through the weekend, he was going to Maple Grove Park on Saturday morning, and he was probably about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He'd also fielded 17 increasingly frantic phone calls from his assistant, 4 from his father, and 1 from the head of the board of directors asking if he was having some kind of breakdown. Marcus had assured everyone he was fine, just handling a family emergency, and that he'd be back in San Francisco by Monday. The family emergency part was technically true. Marcus spent Saturday morning in his hotel room, changing clothes 3 times and practicing different ways to introduce himself to a 2.5-year-old who didn't know he existed. Nothing sounded right. "Hi, I'm your father," seemed like it might be traumatic. "I'm a friend of your mother's," felt like lying. "I'm Marcus," was probably the safest option, but it felt inadequate for the biggest moment of his life. At 9:45, he gave up on finding the perfect outfit and drove to Maple Grove Park in jeans and a sweater, feeling more nervous than he had during his first board presentation. The park was small but well-maintained, with a playground designed for young children and several benches arranged around the perimeter. Marcus chose a bench with a clear view of the entrance and tried to look casual while his heart hammered against his ribs. Elena arrived exactly at 10, pushing David in a stroller and carrying a bag that probably contained snacks and toys and all the other things Marcus had no idea children needed. She spotted him immediately, but didn't acknowledge. His presence, instead, lifting David out of the stroller and setting him loose on the playground equipment. Marcus watched his son explore the playground with the same focused intensity Marcus brought to analyzing market trends. David examined each piece of equipment carefully before trying it, methodical and cautious, but not afraid. When he reached the small slide, he climbed the steps slowly, sat down at the top and looked around the entire park before pushing off. "He's very observant," Marcus said as Eleanor approached his bench, "like his father." Eleanor sat down beside him, close enough to talk but far enough to make it clear this wasn't a reconciliation. "He notices everything. Sometimes I think he understands way more than he can express yet." They watched David play for several minutes without talking. The boy had moved on to a set of swings designed for toddlers and was trying to figure out how to make them work. Elena started to get up to help him, but Marcus was already moving. "May I?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. Marcus approached David slowly, the way he might approach a skittish animal. "Hi there. Need some help with the swing?" David looked up at him with those unmistakable Blackwell blue eyes and studied Marcus's face with unnerving intensity. Finally, he nodded. "Up," David said, pointing at the swing. Marcus lifted his son, and settled him into the swing seat, his hands shaking slightly as he made sure the safety bar was secure. David was solid and warm and real in a way that made everything else feel abstract. "Ready? Go." Marcus gave David a gentle push, and the boy giggled with pure delight. It was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. "Higher," David demanded. Marcus pushed a little harder, and David's laughter filled the park. For about 5 minutes, Marcus forgot about everything, except the joy on his son's face and the simple rhythm of push, swing, giggle, repeat. Then David said, "Mama," and Marcus turned to see Elena watching them with an expression he couldn't read. "Mama, come see, flying." Eleanor walked over with a smile that looked only slightly forced. "Wow, you're flying so high. Are you having fun?" "Fun! Man, help!" Eleanor looked at Marcus. "The man is helping you, that's nice." "What's your name?" David asked Marcus with the straightforward curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions were complicated. Marcus looked at Elena, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "I'm Marcus, what's your name?" "David, nice to meet you, David." "Nice meet you." Marcus continued pushing the swing while Elena stood nearby, and for a few minutes it felt almost like they were a normal family spending Saturday morning at the park. But the illusion couldn't last forever. "More park," David announced when he got tired of the swing. Marcus lifted him out and watched him toddle off toward a set of low-climbing structures. David was fearless but careful, testing each step before committing his full weight. "He's amazing," Marcus said quietly. "He is." Elena's voice was warm, with pride. "He's been walking since he was 10 months old, gets into everything. Yesterday I found him trying to reorganize my bookshelf by color." "Organizing things by color seems very practical. He's definitely your son." Elena sat down on a nearby bench and Marcus joined her. "But he's also got my stubborn streak. When he decides he wants something, he doesn't give up easily." They watched David navigate the climbing structure with determined concentration. Marcus felt overwhelmed by how much he'd already missed. First steps, first words, every small milestone that made up a child's early life. What was his first word? Mama, then no, and then more, right? Pretty standard. Elena smiled. Though last week he learned to say helicopter, and now he points them out every time we hear one. Helicopter? He's obsessed with things that fly. Airplanes, helicopters, birds. Sometimes I wonder if he got that from you. Marcus thought about his own childhood fascination with his father's private jet, how he'd spent hours at airport windows watching planes take off and land. Maybe David had successfully navigated the climbing structure and was now examining a sandbox with scientific interest. He picked up a handful of sand, let it run through his fingers, then looked around for tools to dig with. Sand, he called to Elena. I see. Do you want to play in the sand? Yes, play sand. Elena pulled a set of small shovels and buckets. From her bag, and handed them to David, who immediately got to work on what appeared to be a complex engineering project. He builds things constantly, Eleanor said, watching David construct what might have been a castle, or possibly a space station. Blocks, sand, couch cushions, always building. Marcus felt a strange tightness in his chest. I used to do that, too. Drive my mother crazy building forts out of anything I could find. I remember, you told me about that once, early in our relationship. You said it was the only time you felt like you could create something that was completely yours. The fact that Elena remembered that conversation when Marcus had forgotten sharing it made him feel even worse about how little attention he'd paid to her own stories and dreams. Elena, about what you said yesterday, about me not knowing you. You're right. I don't want to relitigate our marriage, Marcus. That's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Eleanor watched David carefully add another scoop of sand to his construction project. Because despite everything that happened between us, you have a right to know your son, and he has a right to know his father, even if that relationship looks different than either of us planned. What would that look like? I have no idea. I never expected to see you again, let alone have this conversation. David had apparently finished his building project and was now decorating it with small stones he'd found around the sandbox. His focus was absolute, completely absorbed in his creative work. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Okay. Are you involved with anyone? Eleanor was quiet for so long Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer. There's someone I've been seeing for about 6 months. Nothing serious yet, but it could be. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, even though he had no right to be hurt by them. Elena had every reason to move on with her life. Still, the thought of another man helping raise his son, of David calling someone else Dad, made him feel sick. Does David like him? They haven't met yet. I don't introduce David to people unless I'm sure they're going to be around long term. Marcus felt a small surge of relief, followed immediately by shame for feeling relieved. That's smart. I learned to be careful about who I let into our lives. The implication was clear. Marcus had forfeited his automatic right to be part of their lives when he'd failed so completely as a husband. If he wanted to be David's father, he'd have to earn it the same way any other man would. What would I need to do to prove I'm serious about this? Elena looked at him carefully. I don't know yet, but it would start with you figuring out what kind of father you want to be, not what kind of father you think you should be. David had finished his sand project and was looking around for his next activity. He spotted Marcus and Elena on the bench and ran over with the unsteady gait of a toddler who had more enthusiasm than coordination. Look, Maid Castle. Wow, Elena said with genuine enthusiasm. That's a beautiful castle. Did you build it all by yourself? Marcus, help! Both Elena and Marcus looked surprised. David pointed back toward the sandbox. Marcus, help make castle. Marcus realized David was asking him to come see the sand construction. He followed the boy back to the sandbox and crouched down to examine the project. This is incredible, David. How did you make it so tall? David launched into an explanation that was mostly incomprehensible, but clearly very important to him. He used his hands to show Marcus how he'd packed the sand down, pointed out specific architectural features, and demonstrated the structural integrity by gently patting the sides. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the complexity of what David had built. For a 2.5-year-old, it showed remarkable spatial thinking and planning. You're going to be an engineer when you grow up, Marcus said. What's engineer? Someone who builds things, big things, like bridges, and buildings. David's eyes lit up. Build big things, very big things. David considered this seriously, then picked up his shovel and started working on what appeared to be an addition to his castle. Marcus stayed crouched beside him, occasionally offering suggestions or helping stabilize a wall that was getting too tall. After about 20 minutes, Eleanor came over to announce it was time to go. 5 more minutes, David pleaded, using the universal toddler negotiation tactic. We need to go have lunch, Elena said firmly but kindly, but you can build another castle next week. Marcus come next week? The question caught everyone off guard. David was looking at Marcus with hopeful expectation, completely unaware of the complexity of what he was asking. Marcus looked at Elena, who was clearly struggling with how to respond. "Would you like Marcus to come back next week?" Elena asked carefully. "Yes, Marcus helped build." Elena looked at Marcus. "Can you commit to that, to being here next Saturday at 10? The question was about more than just showing up at the park. Elena was asking if Marcus could commit to becoming a consistent presence in David's life, even when it was inconvenient, even when business demanded his attention elsewhere. "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "I'll be here." David clapped his hands together with satisfaction, then ran to give the sandcastle one final pat before letting Elena lead him back to the stroller. "Say bye-bye to Marcus," Elena prompted. "Bye-bye, Marcus. See you next week." "See you next week, David." As Elena strapped David into his stroller, Marcus felt a panicky sense that this perfect morning was ending too soon. "Elena?" She looked up at him. "Thank you for this." "Don't thank me yet. This was the easy part." Elena was right, of course. One morning at the park didn't make him a father any more than one successful meeting made him a businessman. David's dad was going to require fundamental changes in how Marcus approached everything in his life. But watching David wave enthusiastically as the stroller disappeared around the corner, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope that he might actually be capable of becoming the kind of man his son deserved to have as a father. The question was whether he could figure out how to do that before David got old enough to realize his dad was making it up as he went along. Marcus spent the rest of Saturday wandering around Portland, seeing the city through completely different eyes now that he knew Elena and David were part of it. He found himself paying attention to playgrounds and family restaurants and all the infrastructure of normal life that he'd been oblivious to during his years of private jets and exclusive establishments. That evening, he called his assistant and extended his stay through the following weekend. "Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwell? Your father has been asking questions." "Everything's fine. I just need to handle some personal matters." "The Morrison deal can wait until Monday. The world won't end if Marcus Blackwell takes a weekend off." There was silence on the other end of the line. Marcus hadn't taken an unscheduled weekend off since he'd become CEO. "Of course, sir. I'll handle the rescheduling." Marcus hung up and realized he had no idea how to spend a Saturday evening in Portland. During his marriage, he and Elena had occasionally talked about taking vacations where they could just walk around a new city without itineraries or reservations. But somehow they'd never actually done it. There had always been another meeting, another crisis, another reason to postpone being spontaneous. Now he was alone in a city where he knew no one, with an entire evening stretching ahead of him and no obligations except figuring out how to become a better person than he'd been at 32. He ended up at a bookstore of all places, wandering the aisles and trying to remember the last time he'd read something that wasn't a business report or legal document. In the children's section, he found himself overwhelmed by the sheer number of books designed to help parents understand their kids' development. Marcus bought 6 books about toddler psychology and parenting techniques, feeling slightly ridiculous, but determined to educate himself about the small person who had completely upended his life in the span of 24 hours. Back in his hotel room, he spent the evening reading about normal developmental milestones for 2.5-year-olds and trying to figure out whether David's obvious intelligence was remarkable or if Marcus simply had no baseline for comparison. By Sunday morning, Marcus had filled a legal pad with notes about appropriate activities for toddlers, communication strategies, and the importance of consistent routines. He felt like he was preparing for the most important business presentation of his life, which in a way he was. Monday morning brought reality crashing back. Marcus's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. with increasingly urgent calls about deals that had stalled in his absence, and board members who were questioning his sudden disappearance. "Marcus, what the hell is going on?" His father's voice was sharp, with frustration. "Henderson says you've been unreachable for 3 days. I told you I had a family emergency." "What family?" "You don't have any family except this company." The word stung more than Marcus expected. That's not true anymore. What's that supposed to mean? Marcus realized he was going to have to tell his father about David eventually. Richard Blackwell wasn't going to be easily distracted from demanding explanations for his son's unprecedented absence from business. Elena and I have a child together, a son. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Elena? Your ex-wife, Elena? Yes. Yes. How is that possible? You've been divorced for 3 years. She was pregnant when she left, I just found out. Another long silence. Where have they been? Portland. She's been living in Portland. And you're sure the child is yours? Marcus felt his temper flare. Yes, I'm sure. Marcus, you need to be very careful here. A woman with a child could make claims. Don't. Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. Don't go there, Dad. I'm just saying you need to protect yourself and the company. Have you talked to legal? This isn't a business transaction. Everything is a business transaction, son, especially when it involves someone who walked away from a settlement worth $50 million. Marcus had forgotten that detail. Elena had refused any alimony or asset division, taking only her personal belongings when she left. At the time, he'd been too hurt and angry to question why she'd walked away from financial security. Now he understood she'd been trying to make a clean break, to ensure she could never be accused of staying in the marriage for money. She doesn't want anything from me, Marcus said. Then what does she want? Marcus looked out his hotel window toward the neighborhood, where Elena and David were probably having breakfast, starting their Monday morning routine that had nothing to do with stock prices or board meetings. She wants me to figure out how to be a father. You can be a father from San Francisco, set up a trust fund, arrange visitation, hire the best family lawyers in the country. You don't need to disrupt your entire life. The suggestion made Marcus feel sick. Is that how you were a father to me? I provided for you. I made sure you had every advantage, every opportunity. You handed me off to nannies and boarding schools and tutors. I barely saw you except at company events. And you turned out fine. Marcus thought about Elena's accusation that he'd tried to turn their marriage into a business transaction, about David's easy laughter at the park, about all the moments of genuine connection he'd missed because he'd been too busy, proving himself worthy of the Blackwell legacy. No, Dad, I didn't turn out fine. I turned out just like you. This time, the silence lasted almost a minute. Marcus, you're upset. You've had a shock. Take the week to process this, then come home and we'll figure out the best way to handle the situation. I am handling it. By hiding in Portland instead of running the company your great-grandfather built? By learning how to be the kind of man my son can be proud of. Marcus hung up before his father could respond, then immediately called his assistant. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. I'm staying in Portland. Mr. Blackwell, the Morrison meeting is Wednesday. We've been trying to schedule this for months. Then schedule it for next week. Your father specifically requested, my father doesn't run this company, I do. Cancel everything. Marcus hung up and realized his hands were shaking. He'd never directly contradicted his father's business priorities before, never put personal considerations ahead of company obligations. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. The week passed in a strange suspended reality where Marcus tried to learn how to exist in Portland without disrupting Elena and David's routine. He ate at neighborhood diners instead of five-star restaurants, walked everywhere instead of being driven, and spent his evenings reading parenting books instead of financial reports. By Thursday, he'd worked up the courage to call Elena. Hi, it's Marcus. I know, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I was wondering, would it be possible for me to see David again before Saturday, maybe during the week? Elena was quiet for a moment. What did you have in mind? I don't know. Whatever would work for you. I keep thinking about him building that sandcastle, and I'd like to spend more time with him. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay, are you doing this because you genuinely want to be David's father, or because you feel guilty about missing the first 2.5 years of his life? The question caught Marcus off guard, mostly because he wasn't sure he knew the answer. Both, maybe. Guilt isn't a good enough reason to disrupt a child's life. It's not just guilt. When I was watching him play at the park when he asked me to help with his castle, I felt something I've never felt before, like I was seeing what actually matters. Elena sighed. David has a routine, Marcus. He goes to daycare on weekdays while I work. He needs consistency. What if I picked him up from daycare one day this week, took him to dinner somewhere kid-friendly, brought him home by bedtime? You want to take my 2-year-old to dinner? By yourself? When Elena put it that way, Marcus realized how ridiculous the suggestion sounded. He had no idea how to feed a toddler dinner, no idea what kids ate, or how to handle a meltdown in a restaurant or any of the practical realities of solo childcare. Maybe that's not the best place to start, he admitted. What if you came over for dinner tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and hanging out. You could see how David here's in his normal environment. The offer was more than Marcus had dared to hope for. Are you sure? 6 o'clock, and Marcus? David goes to bed at 7:30, so don't expect a long evening. Friday evening, Marcus stood outside Elena's duplex, holding a bouquet of flowers for Elena and a toy airplane for David, nervous in a way he hadn't been since high school. Through the window, he could see Elena in the kitchen and hear David's voice chattering about something that sounded very important. Elena answered the door wearing jeans and a sweater that had what looked like finger paint on the sleeve. She looked beautiful and real and like everything Marcus had forgotten he wanted. Those are lovely, she said, accepting the flowers. Thank you. Airplane! David appeared at Elena's side, somehow having spotted his gift from across the room. David, what do you say? Elena prompted. Thank you. David immediately tore into the wrapping paper, with the focused intensity Marcus was learning was typical for him. When he discovered the toy airplane, his face lit up with pure joy. Airplane, look, Mama, airplane. I see, that's a very cool airplane. What do you say to Marcus? David launched himself at Marcus's legs in what Marcus realized was meant to be a hug. The feeling of his son's small arms wrapped around him was overwhelming. Thank you, Marcus. You're welcome, buddy. Dinner was both easier and harder than Marcus had expected. David was talkative and funny, narrating his day at daycare and demonstrating the proper technique for eating spaghetti with his hands, despite Elena's attempts to encourage fork usage. But Marcus also felt completely out of his depth. He didn't know how to respond when David asked if airplanes were bigger than elephants, had no idea whether it was normal for a 2-year-old to require 17 different negotiations about finishing his vegetables, and found himself marveling at Elena's patience with questions that seemed to have no logical answers. David, if you eat 3 more bites of broccoli, you can play with your airplane after dinner, Elena said calmly. 2 bites? 3 bites. 2.5 bites? Eleanor looked at Marcus with barely concealed amusement. He's going to be a lawyer. 2.5 bites, David said decisively, apparently considering this a successful negotiation. After dinner, David insisted on showing Marcus his room, which was small but filled with books and toys and artwork that had clearly been created with love rather than money. Marcus found himself comparing it to his own childhood bedroom, which had been professionally decorated and maintained by staff, but had never felt particularly personal. This is my bed, David announced, climbing onto a twin bed covered with a quilt that looked handmade. And this is Bear. David held up a well-loved stuffed animal that had clearly been through many adventures. Bear sleeps with me every night. Bear looks like a very good friend. Bear is my best friend. But maybe you can be my friend too. The question hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. I would like that very much. Good. Want to read story? David was already pulling books from a small shelf beside his bed, clearly expecting Marcus to sit down and begin immediately. Marcus looked at Eleanor for guidance. He usually gets 2 stories before bed, Elena said, but you don't have to. I want to. Marcus settled onto the small bed next to David, who immediately cuddled against his side with the casual trust of a child who hadn't yet learned that not all adults were safe. The weight of his son against his side felt like the most important thing Marcus had ever been trusted with. This one. David handed Marcus a book about a bear who learned to ride a bicycle. Marcus began reading, stumbling slightly over the rhythm of children's literature, which was apparently more complex than quarterly earnings reports. David listened, with rapt attention, occasionally pointing out details in the illustrations or predicting what would happen next. Halfway through the second book, David's eyes started getting heavy. By the time Marcus finished reading, David was asleep against his shoulder, still clutching his airplane. Eleanor appeared in the doorway and smiled at the sight of them together. "He likes you. He's incredible," Marcus whispered, afraid to move and wake David up. "He is. Here, let me help you get him under the covers." Together, they carefully maneuvered David under his quilt without waking him. Eleanor kissed his forehead and turned on a small nightlight, then led Marcus back to the living room. "How do you do this every night?" Marcus asked. "The dinner negotiations and the bedtime routine and all of it?" "Practice and lots of coffee." Elena settled onto the couch beside him. "It gets easier and harder. Every stage brings new challenges." "I missed so much." "You can't think about it that way. You'll drive yourself crazy." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of them processing the evening. Marcus felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, overwhelmed by how much he still didn't know about being a parent, but certain that he wanted to learn. "Eleanor." "Yeah? What's the man you're seeing like?" Eleanor looked surprised by the question. "Why do you want to know?" "Because if you're going to marry him, he'll be in David's life. I want to know what kind of person that would be." "I'm not going to marry him, Marcus." "But you said—" "I said it could be serious, not that it would be." Elena pulled her legs up under her on the couch. "Dating as a single mother is complicated. Most men aren't interested in taking on someone else's child." "Their loss," Elena smiled. "David is pretty great, but he's also a lot of responsibility, and he takes up most of my time and energy. That's hard for people to understand if they don't have kids." Marcus thought about his own relationship history since the divorce, a series of women who were interested in the lifestyle his money could provide, but had no interest in anything deeper. He'd told himself he preferred it that way, that he wasn't ready for anything serious. But sitting here in Elena's living room, watching her straighten David's toys, and listening to the quiet sounds of a home where a family actually lived, Marcus realized he'd been lying to himself. "Can I ask you something else?" Elena nodded. "Do you think there's any chance we could try again, not immediately, but someday?" Elena was quiet for a long time, looking down at her hands. "Marcus, I can't think about that right now." "Why not?" "Because right now I need to figure out whether you're capable of being David's father. That's all I can handle. Adding the possibility of an adult relationship on top of that, it's too much." "But it's not impossible." "I don't know. 3 years ago, you broke my heart so completely, I wasn't sure I'd ever want to trust anyone again. I'm just starting to remember what it feels like to believe someone might actually see me as a person instead of an accessory to their life." The words stung, but Marcus knew he deserved them. "I see you now. Do you? Or do you see the mother of your child who might be willing to let you back into our lives?" Marcus didn't have a good answer for that question, mostly because he wasn't entirely sure himself. Everything had happened so fast, discovering David's existence, realizing what he'd lost when Elena left, seeing how completely she'd rebuilt her life without him. His feelings were all tangled up with guilt and regret, and a desperate need to fix something he'd broken 3 years ago. "I don't know," he said finally. "I wish I could say I see you clearly, but I'm still figuring out what that means." Eleanor nodded, looking almost relieved by his honesty. "At least you're not pretending to have all the answers." "I definitely don't have all the answers. I don't even know the questions yet. The questions get easier. It's the answers that are hard." Marcus looked around the small living room with its mismatched furniture and David's toys scattered in, corners and photos covering every surface. It felt more like home than his penthouse ever had, even when Elena had lived there with him. "I should go," he said, though he didn't want to leave. "It's getting late." "Marcus!" Elena walked him to the door. "Thank you for dinner and for reading to David. He doesn't have many men in his life, so it meant something to him." "It meant something to me, too." Elena smiled, the first completely genuine smile she'd given him since that day at the park. "See you Saturday?" "I'll be there." Marcus drove back to his hotel, feeling like his entire understanding of what mattered had shifted again. Sitting in David's room, reading stories about bears and airplanes, had felt more important than any board meeting he'd ever attended. And the way David had fallen asleep against his shoulder, trusting and peaceful, had given Marcus a sense of purpose he'd never found in quarterly earnings reports. But Elena's question haunted him. Was he capable of seeing her as a person, or would he always see her primarily as David's mother, the key to accessing his son's life? Saturday morning came with Portland's typical drizzle, but Marcus was at Maple Grove Park by 9:45, armed with a thermos of coffee and a waterproof jacket he'd bought specifically for playground duty. He was learning that being David's father meant being prepared for weather, mess, and the unexpected. Helena arrived right on time, with David bundled up in a tiny raincoat and boots that looked like they belonged on a firefighter. "Rain boots!" David announced proudly, stomping in a puddle to demonstrate their effectiveness. "Very impressive. Boots," Marcus agreed. "Are you ready to build another castle?" "Yes, but maybe spaceship today." A spaceship sounds perfect. They spent the morning in the sandbox, with David directing the construction of what he explained was a rocket ship. Capable of traveling to the moon, Marcus found himself completely absorbed in the project, consulting seriously with David about propulsion systems and landing gear as if they were designing an actual spacecraft. "This is mission control," David said, patting a small mound of sand, "and this is where astronauts sit. Where do they keep their food?" David considered this seriously, then began hollowing out a section of the rocket. "Food goes here, and juice boxes." Very practical. Astronauts need juice boxes. Elena watched from a nearby bench, occasionally taking photos with her phone, but mostly just letting Marcus and David work together. Marcus was becoming more comfortable with David's conversational style, which jumped between topics with the logic of a 2-year-old, but somehow always circled back to whatever engineering project was at hand. After they'd finished the spaceship, and David had exhausted himself running around the playground, Eleanor suggested they get hot chocolate from the cafe across the street. "Can Marcus come?" David asked, as Eleanor buckled him into his stroller. "Would you like Marcus to come?" Elena asked. "Yes, Marcus likes hot chocolate." Marcus realized David had just made an assumption about his preferences and decided to stick with it. "I love hot chocolate." The cafe was small and crowded, the kind of neighborhood place where the baristas knew everyone's usual order, and kids were welcome even when they were loud. Elena ordered for David without asking what he wanted. Apparently his preferences were well established, while Marcus studied the menu like it contained state secrets. "Overwhelmed by the choices?" Elena asked with amusement. "I usually have someone else handle my coffee orders." "Right. I forgot you're too important to choose your own beverages." Marcus looked at her sharply, but Elena was smiling. It was teasing, not criticism. "I'm trying to learn how to do normal things," he said. "Ordering coffee is pretty normal." "Medium hot chocolate," Marcus told the barista, feeling absurdly proud of himself for completing the transaction without assistance. They found a table near the window, where David could watch cars and pedestrians while he worked on his hot chocolate. Marcus was fascinated watching Elena anticipate David's needs, cutting up a muffin into toddler-sized pieces, wiping his face before he realized he needed it, engaging him in conversation that kept him happy and occupied. How do you know what he needs before he knows it himself? Practice and paying attention. You start to recognize the signs, when he's getting tired, when he's about to have a meltdown, when he needs a distraction. What are the signs? Elena considered the question seriously. When he gets tired, he starts getting clumsy and his attention span gets shorter. When he's about to melt down, he gets very focused on something small and starts negotiating everything. When he needs a distraction, he gets that look like he's planning something that's probably going to result in chaos. As if on cue, David got exactly the look Elena had just described and started eyeing the stack of napkins on their table with obvious intent. "David," Elena said calmly, "napkins stay on the table." "Just one napkin?" "Napkins stay on the table." "On the table." David considered this, then turned his attention to the stirring sticks instead. Eleanor smoothly moved them out of his reach without making it seem like a confrontation. "How did you learn all this?" Marcus asked. "Trial and error." "A lot of error," Eleanor smiled. "The first few months were brutal. I had no idea what I was doing, and David was not an easy baby. He wanted to be held constantly, never slept through the night, had opinions about everything." "You did it alone?" "My mom helped when she could, but she was still working full-time. Mostly it was just me figuring it out as I went." Marcus felt a fresh wave of guilt. Elena had been learning how to be a mother while he'd been attending charity galas and closing business deals, completely unaware that his son existed. "Eleanor, I'm sorry for not being there, for all of it." "Marcus, we've been over this. You can't change the past, but I can do better going forward. Can you?" Eleanor looked at him directly. "When David gets sick in the middle of the night and needs to go to the emergency room, are you going to be available? When he has a meltdown in the grocery store and everyone's staring, are you going to handle it calmly? When he goes through a phase where he only wants one parent and rejects the other, are you going to be patient and consistent until he works through it?" The questions hit Marcus like a series of punches. He'd been thinking about being David's father in terms of fun activities and bonding moments, not the difficult, mundane, exhausting reality of daily parenting. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I want to try. Trying isn't enough. David needs reliability, not good intentions." David had finished his hot chocolate and was starting to get restless, making increasingly elaborate attempts to engage the people at nearby tables in conversation. "Ready to go, buddy?" Elena asked. "5 more minutes? We need to go home and have lunch. 3 more minutes? Time to go." David's face started to scrunch up in preparation for protest, but Elena was already standing and gathering there, things with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd navigated this negotiation many times before. "David, do you want to walk to the car or ride in the stroller?" Faced with a choice that made him feel like he had some control, David abandoned his protest. "Walk." "Okay, but you have to hold my hand in the parking lot." "Hold Marcus' hand." "Two?" David reached for both their hands, leaving Marcus and Elena connected through their son as they walked to Elena's car. For a moment, they probably looked like any other family finishing a Saturday morning outing. "Thank you for including me," Marcus said, as Elena got David settled in his car seat. "Thank you for showing up. Consistently. That matters more than you probably realize." Marcus drove back to his hotel, thinking about Elena's questions regarding his reliability and availability. His entire adult life had been structured around business priorities, with personal commitments fitting in around the edges. But David wouldn't understand that Daddy couldn't read bedtime stories because he had a conference call with Tokyo, or that family dinner had to be rescheduled because of an emergency board meeting. That afternoon, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He called his assistant and asked her to block out every Saturday morning for the foreseeable future. "Every Saturday, Mr. Blackwell. Every Saturday. No meetings, no calls, no exceptions." "What should I tell people who want to schedule Saturday meetings? That I'm not available on Saturday mornings, period." It was a small step, but it felt revolutionary. Marcus Blackwell had just declared that something in his personal life was more important than business, and the world hadn't ended. The following week brought a crisis that tested Marcus's newfound commitment to being present for David. A major deal was falling apart, requiring round-the-clock negotiations to salvage. His father called 3 times demanding that Marcus return to San Francisco immediately. "This is exactly what I was worried about," Richard Blackwell said during their third conversation. "You're letting personal distractions interfere with business priorities." "David isn't a distraction, he's my son, and Blackwell Industries is your legacy. Which matters more?" For the first time in his life, Marcus didn't have to think about the answer. "My son matters more." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Dad, I can handle the negotiations from here. We have video conferencing, secure connections, everything we need. It's not the same as being in the room." "Then, maybe the other parties will have to accept that I'm not available to be in the room this week." Marcus hung up and immediately called Elena. "Hi, it's Marcus. I know this is short notice, but I'm dealing with a work crisis this week, and I'm going to be on calls pretty much constantly. I don't think I should see David until it's resolved. I don't want him to experience me being distracted and unavailable." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's very thoughtful of you." "Is it? It feels like I'm already failing at this whole consistency thing." Marcus, recognizing that you can't be present and making arrangements accordingly, is exactly what good parents do. The problem would be if you tried to see David while you were distracted and stressed. So I'm not completely screwing this up. You're learning. That's what matters. Marcus managed to resolve the business crisis by Friday, but it required 18-hour days and the kind of intense focus that left him exhausted. By Saturday morning, he was questioning whether he had the energy to be the kind of father David deserved. But David's face when he saw Marcus at the park made every sleepless night worth it. "Marcus, look, I brought Airplane." David was clutching the toy airplane Marcus had given him, which was now showing signs of heavy use and constant companionship. "Did you bring it to show me something special?" "Airplane can fly," David demonstrated, by running in circles with the plane extended above his head, making elaborate swooshing sounds. Marcus found himself running alongside David, both of them, making airplane noises and probably looking ridiculous to other park visitors. But David's laughter was infectious, and Marcus realized he felt lighter than he had all week. "Want to build airplane runway?" David suggested when they'd exhausted themselves with flying. "That sounds perfect." They spent the morning constructing an elaborate airport in the sandbox, complete with runways, control towers, and hangars for David's growing fleet of toy aircraft. Marcus found himself completely absorbed in the project, forgetting about conference calls and board meetings and everything else that had seemed so urgent a few hours ago. "This is the best airport ever," Marcus said, genuinely impressed by David's architectural vision. "Best airport in the world," David agreed, then crashed his airplane into the sand with enthusiasm. "Airplane needs fix now." "Oh no, should we take it to the mechanic?" David nodded seriously and began examining the plane with the focused attention of a professional aircraft inspector. "Engine broken. Needs new engine." "Can you fix it?" "I can fix." David began making elaborate mechanical adjustments to the toy plane, complete with sound effects for power tools and technical explanations that were incomprehensible but clearly very important. Watching David's complete absorption in his imaginary repair work, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This was what he'd been missing. Not just time with his son, but the ability to be completely present in a moment, focused on something. That mattered simply because it brought joy. "Marcus," Elena had approached without him noticing, carrying coffee for both of them. "You looked like you could use caffeine." "Thank you. How long have you been watching us?" "About 20 minutes. You two were very focused on airplane maintenance." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully and realized Elena was studying his face with concern. "You look exhausted." "Work crisis. It's resolved now." "When's the last time you slept?" Marcus had to think about it. "Tuesday, maybe Wednesday." "Marcus, you can't sustain that kind of schedule, especially not if you want to be present for David." "I know. I'm figuring out how to balance everything." Elena sat down beside him on the bench where they'd had their first real conversation 3 weeks ago. David was now conducting test flights of his repaired airplane, providing detailed commentary on its improved performance. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said. "Sure. What do you actually want? Not what you think you should want, or what would make up for lost time, but what do you really want your relationship with David to look like?" Marcus watched David demonstrate the airplane's new capabilities, complete with barrel rolls and emergency landings. "I want to be the kind of father who knows his favorite book and his favorite food, and what makes him laugh. I want him to feel like he can tell me anything. I want to be someone he's proud to call Dad." "That's a good answer. Good answer. Is it realistic?" "It's realistic if you're willing to prioritize it over everything else. Being that kind of father requires showing up consistently, even when it's inconvenient. It means David's needs come first, even when business is demanding your attention." Marcus thought about the phone calls he'd ignored from his father this week, the meetings he'd rescheduled, the deals he'd handled remotely instead of flying to handle in person. I'm starting to understand that. It's hard, especially when you're used to being in control of everything. Kids don't respect your schedule or your priorities. They need what they need when they need it. David had apparently completed his test flight program and was now constructing what looked like a passenger terminal out of sand and small stones. "Need help building terminal?" he called to Marcus. Marcus looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. "Coming, buddy." As Marcus rejoined David in the sandbox, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, not for their relationship. That was still too complicated and uncertain. But hope that Marcus might actually be capable of becoming the father David deserved. The transformation wasn't complete, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and challenges ahead. But watching Marcus patiently help David construct architectural marvels out of sand, seeing the genuine joy on his face when David laughed, witnessing his willingness to put business aside for playground duty, these were signs that maybe, just maybe, Marcus was finally learning what actually mattered. David had been right when he'd proclaimed that this was the best airport in the world. But more than that, Elena realized, this was becoming something she'd never dared to hope for, a real family, built not on obligation or guilt, but on genuine love and commitment to showing up for each other. The question now was whether Marcus could sustain this new version of himself when the novelty wore off and parenting became routine rather than revelation. Only time would tell, but for the first time in 3 years, Elena was willing to find out.